Hi friends, welcome to episode 28 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. It is that time of the year, spring. The kids are batty, and all the procedures that we've had in place all year seem to have been forgotten. My students more resemble the ones I had in September, and I have several theories. Yes, the weather has changed. Increasingly, our students can now dash outside without boots or snow pants, hats, or gloves and the like. School is wrapping up. The beginning of the end. The countdown has begun. You can sense it in the teachers, and the kids are all picking up on this. And this is also, for all grade levels, standardized testing season. The kids are testing for long periods of time, and their behavior is a direct result. I've also noticed more guest teachers or substitutes in the building, which always results in batty behavior. Teachers realize that they haven't used their personal days, or perhaps they're out for training. Regardless, our students' behavior is at its worst when a guest teacher or a sub is covering a classroom. If you've hit your grade level benchmarks and all your curricular requirements, then instead of ending the school year on a whimper, instead of fizzling out because checkouts are going to stop soon and our inventory is going to start, ramp up your lessons with fun, not filler. These activities, which, if you have time, are a welcome change for you and your students. Just because the students have checked out and spring fever has taken over and the squirrely behavior has become the norm, doesn't mean that the library has to devolve into something unpleasant. Here are several suggestions. Consider playing some games like a Dewey Decimal game or library bingo, or having scavenger hunts using either online databases and encyclopedias or low-tech with clipboards and Dewey Decimal call numbers. Use this opportunity for Genius Hour or passion projects or author explorations. I sometimes like to have poetry performances with my older students. You could have makerspace activities or musical chairs with your fiction and nonfiction. I would like to extend a special welcome to the listeners in countries which are rounding out the top 10 for this podcast in our downloads. Hello to school librarians in South Africa and in India, in Spain, and in Ireland. I welcome you and all our listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook or Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you remember to include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. Let's dive into today's topic, graphic novels, preaching to the choir. It should come as no surprise that an episode on the issue of graphic novels in our collections has been in the works for a long time. In fact, a list of podcast episode ideas was generated long before I even had a podcast name or a logo. I contemplated opening this episode with a soul-crushing recounting of emails which have been sent to me by teachers imploring me to discourage their students from checking out graphic novels and to guide my students to more, quote, substantial books, end quote. But you have all experienced those email requests firsthand for yourselves. Instead, this episode will focus on ways to empower school librarians with talking points to successfully convince those who dispute the value of graphic novels and just how much our students benefit from reading them. Until I read Annie Ward's article titled The Nutritional Value of Dessert Books, I'll confess I, on more than one occasion, referred to my graphic novel collection as the library's cookie jar. A teacher had noticed the graphic novels had moved to their very own section in my library. An office bookcase had been removed, and my custodian knew I would never turn away a hand-me-down bookshelf. So now I had a standalone bookcase to display this collection, which I took great care to grow with each book order. Little did I know that by calling the graphic novels a cookie jar, in doing so, I relegated them to a lesser status than, say, chapter books or informational text. My intention by using such terminology was to simply imply that graphic novels were something everybody could enjoy. But what I had actually done was to belittle their value. Annie Ward includes a quote by Dave Pilkey regarding reader choice. Quote, "Love is the key. Love leads to habits. Habits lead to skill. When it comes to kids reading, there are no guilty pleasures." End quote. It could not have been more timely, but this past Wednesday, I attended a webinar provided by the AASL, co-sponsored by the Graphic Novels and Comic Roundtable of the American Library Association, titled Addressing the Gatekeepers: How to Turn Comic and Graphic Novel Skeptics into Believers. Here is the description of the program. Quote, "While many librarians and educators understand the value of comics and graphic novels, there are still those who need convincing. How do we get these resistant gatekeepers to open the doors and let comics in? This webinar will give you tools to address concerns, dispel myths, and show the benefits of comics and graphic novels bring to classrooms and libraries. Learn how creators, publishers, and librarians have dealt with these issues. Panelists include Betsy Gomez from the Banned Books Coalition and the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, John Jennings, a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California at Riverside, and Chloe Ramos Peterson from Image Comics, Emily Radica, a high school teacher librarian in San Bernardino, California, and a member of AASL's introduction program, will moderate. I was riveted. This hour-long exchange, and I wanted to include some of the highlights so that everyone could appreciate what was mentioned in this webinar. First of all, I heard the word convert used repeatedly, and I agree that if we are to promote and protect our students' accessibility to graphic novels in our libraries, a certain amount of converting is going to have to happen, both with the classroom teachers and with the parents. The panel first addressed a common misconceptions held by those who are not fans of the graphic novel format. Ironically, the first and the second misconception compete with one another. The first misconception, that comics are only for kids and aren't capable of conveying high-level concepts, sophisticated ideas. And this is a rather outdated idea. The second misconception, which diametrically opposes it, is that comics are filled with adult content and are not appropriate for kids. The third objection is that pop media can't be intellectual, like fiction and literature are two different areas of a bookstore. And the fourth idea raised was that if ideas are illustrated, they can't be complex. Number 5 is that graphic novels are perceived to be gateways to real books. This is not the case, and we need to combat that notion. The sixth issue that was raised was that Marvel and DC are the sort of juggernauts, and they do not represent the entire graphic novel industry. The seventh issue raised is that comics are popular and pop culture, and that means that they can't also be considered culture. So how do people deal with these misconceptions? How do we as school librarians push back when teachers and administrators and parents raise these concerns? First of all, the concern that comics don't teach fluency. They do. They just teach a different type of fluency, and that is of combining words and images which fire up different parts of the brain. Graphic novels encourage problem solving, and they hone students' critical thinking skills. The second key point is that graphic novels encourage multimodal literacy, and that is, instead of a 19th or 20th century literacy, now the visual literacy is strengthened. The third point made by the panel was that when well-intentioned individuals shove texts in front of a student, it can actually be a disservice and discourage students when they're not ready to read or receive that information. And fourth, that reluctant readers sometimes like to hide their lower reading level, and using graphic novels oftentimes has less stigma. It helps them with their self-esteem and help them grow their reading identity by carrying around a book that is perhaps more socially acceptable than, saying, using a lower-level picture book. There was an important caveat that was given during the panel discussion, and that is that graphic novels tend to have shorter sentences, and this results in lower lexile levels, which is not going to be helpful when you're trying to match a reader to the appropriate reading levels. And I did see this issue get raised as well on Facebook this week, because the issue is that regardless of the age of our patrons, when we're trying to determine difference between designated reading level versus an interest level, the reading level will, because graphic novels have fewer words in them, tend to be lower, but the lower reading level will not necessarily correspond to a lower interest level. And unless you have the benefit of previewing an actual copy, you might have to rely on the reviews given by, say, Common Sense Media or School Library Journal or Follett or Goodreads to make sure that the book you're giving to a student is appropriate. The panel also encouraged that librarians are advocates and engage in a stronger partnership with building the curriculum in your district, becoming vocal and more persistent and perhaps a little sneaky in getting graphic novels onto the lists approved by the Board of Education for the curriculum. One of the panelists mentioned that the Common Core state standards also includes mention of the graphic novels. Unfortunately, this was something I didn't have a chance to explore, but if this is the case, that would give additional consideration for titles to be added to part of your district curriculum. The panel discussion ended with a very important point, and that is quantity is more important than quality. If kids are reading all the time, how difficult or what they are reading becomes less critical. And this is something which I really would like to explore in greater detail in the future. What about gatekeepers when it comes to the students' access to books? All the gatekeepers in our students' lives, parents, teachers, librarians, each group is responsible for students' access to books, and each group arguably has interests which at times overlap and at times conflict. Parents entrust school and everyone therein to instruct and guide and support their child in lieu of them. We in the schools are expected to act in the place of parents whenever necessary. Teachers juggle a great many responsibilities when it comes to their students. They are gatekeepers in so much that their classroom libraries directly reflect their grade level, learning objectives, range of reading levels, and yes, their preferences. When so many books on the shelves of classroom libraries have been purchased with personal funds, it shouldn't be surprising that these books reflect the personal interests and preferences of the classroom teachers. Public librarians, in my honest opinion, have the most latitude when it comes to their role as gatekeepers. School librarians, on the other hand, work with constraints which, arguably, our counterparts in the public library do not. As a librarian, I can believe that all my students have the right to read whatever they like. But the reality is, as an employee of a school district, we must abide by the standards of performance outlined by our collective bargaining agreement. Our contracts spell out professional responsibilities, a code of ethics, our obligations to our students and to the public. I would love to waive my ALA Reader's Bill of Rights statute on school and minor rights and say, see, kids are allowed to check out whatever they want from the school library. Let's, for the benefit of anyone who has not recently taken a look at the ALA statute on schools and minor rights, hear what it stipulates. I will include a link in the show notes. It states, Our founders recognized that public schools are a vital institution of American democracy, but education, they also knew, involved more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education in a democratic society requires developing citizens who can adapt to changing times, make decisions about social issues, and effectively judge the performance of public officials. In fulfilling their responsibilities, public schools must not only provide knowledge of many subject areas and essential skills, but also must educate students on core American values such as fairness, equality, justice, respect for others, and the right to dissent. In 2014, additional wording was included to say, quote, library policies and procedures that effectively deny minors equal and equitable access to all library resources available to other users violate the Library Bill of Rights. The American Library Association opposes all attempts to restrict access to library services, materials, and facilities based on the age of library users. End quote. For school librarians, it isn't that cut and dry. We work with administrators who evaluate us each year, teachers to support, and parents for every student we instruct. How do we respond to the other gatekeepers in our students' lives? What do we say to concerned parents and teachers who reject graphic novels as authentic reading? How do we acknowledge their concerns, but also advocate for reader choice? This act of diplomacy isn't easy, but it is critical that we do not alienate members of our building staff and parents who could be the deciding vote on the next PTO measure to fund library purchases. Let's be honest. School librarians need the support of everyone, from the community taxpayers to central administration, if our programs are going to continue. Perhaps the most eloquent defense was in a blog post by Pernille Ripp on October 10, 2018. Author of 4 books, including Passionate Readers, The Art of Reaching and Engaging Every Child, as well as Passionate Learners, How to Engage and Empower Your Students. In this essay, she emphasizes the importance of how we respond to these concerns. Pernille Ripp refutes the idea that graphic novels are too easy or just for fun or don't have substance. Pernille Ripp says that, quote, when you tell a child that the book they have chosen is too easy, you may be dismissing the first book they have ever connected with. You may be dismissing the first book they have ever actually enjoyed. You may be dismissing the first book they have ever seen themselves in. You may be dismissing the first book that made them finally believe that they too are a reader. Because you see, when we tell kids that a book is too easy, we are dismissing their entire reading journey. We are dismissing who they are as readers and just how much work it may have taken to get there. We are telling them that their reading journey only has value if they read books that we deem appropriate, and that is never okay. End quote. She concludes by arguing that graphic novels are, quote, full-fledged literary components that deserve not just to be placed in the hands of our students, but also taught alongside other books, to be held up as shining examples of literary greatness that we should appreciate, promote, and celebrate alongside all of the other books we have, end quote. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to explore Pernille Ripp's blog and her books. She gives wonderful interviews. If you are ever interested, I would recommend listening to Jennifer Gonzalez's Cult of Pedagogy podcast. I've included a link in the show notes of the references to Pernille Ripp and her interviews. Stacey DeCotis, a 5th grade teacher, wrote an article for the Nerdy Book Club blog on February 10th, 2019, titled, Graphic Novels Are Books Too. I especially like this article because I think there is hope that some teachers will recognize the importance of their students' access to graphic novels. Stacey describes how she used graphic novels to lure reluctant readers in her class. She also references a terrific publication put out by BookRiot.com, written by Molly Weta, titled Annual Reminder That Graphic Novels Are Real Reading. In this, Molly highlights 5 literary merits of comics and graphic novels. Some of these are echoed in the panel discussion I mentioned earlier, and that is graphic novels are great for developing readers' vocabulary, in appealing to visual learners. Readers of graphic novels have to learn how to infer and read between the lines. And finally, graphic novels help students develop, and I'll quote, modern literacy, being fluent in a range of mediums, including the interpretation of images, end quote. Micah Johnson, writing for Knowledge Quest, posted an article on September 20th, 2018, titled Graphic Novelizations in the ELA Classroom. I'll include a link in the show notes. She describes an effort to use graphic novelizations with English language learners to correspond with the novels being read in the ELA classroom. While there are some pairings which have been successful, unfortunately there aren't many, and the key concern raised was that for the purposes of parallel instruction, that the, quote, graphic novel is a quality representation of the actual text novel and not a replacement for the text, end quote. Micah Johnson concludes that school librarians partner with the ELA and ELL teachers in the process of identifying appropriate graphic novelizations when books are approved and incorporated into the district curriculum. To draw an important distinction between graphic adaptations and a graphic novelization, I did want to mention at this point, for those who would argue that graphic novels are fluffy or don't delve into sophisticated topics, that this January a graphic adaptation of Anne Frank's diary was published. It was adapted by Ari Folman and illustrated by David Polonsky. I included a link to the New York Times review in the show notes. And while some may argue that depicting something horrific as the Holocaust in graphic novel format is trivializing or somehow making light of this tragedy, it isn't the first time. Maus, by Art Spiegelman, has been translated into over 30 languages and was the first graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. I was mortified to learn, during the same month that Anne Frank's graphic novelization came out, that some high school students had used Nazi salutes to invite their dates to dances and in group photos. I'll include a link of the news coverage in the show notes. More importantly is the alarming statistic in the article that cited a study that an estimated 66% of millennials in the United States did not know what Auschwitz was. A representative for the school district said that although the district teaches about the Holocaust, quote, it has apparently not been enough. We as a community must do an even better job of educating students about Hitler and the Holocaust, end quote. It is for that very reason that I would argue that we need more books like this in our collection. Shifting gears, no conversation about graphic novels and comic books would be complete without including a contribution from the late Stan Lee. In an interview conducted on May 18, 2014, with American Library magazine, Stan Lee offered, quote, I have listened to teachers, professors, and scholars say that reading comic books is one of the best ways to teach literacy to young children. Because in order to enjoy and appreciate and be wrapped up in a comic book, you have to be able to read the dialogue balloons. Otherwise, you won't know what's happening. The youngsters forces himself or herself to read what is lettered there in order to follow the story. So many teachers have told me that when they put comic books in the classroom, children get better marks more quickly in English and literacy than in any other way, end quote. Stan Lee goes on to say, quote, a library should be a way for a child, for anybody, to get the sort of reading that he or she wants. And for that reason, comic books should be in every library, end quote. I will mention at this point that I have an episode recorded on January 27th titled, Give Them What They Want, and it addresses the importance of considering students' reading preferences when generating our purchase orders. Continuing with Mr. Lee's interview, I especially enjoyed the part where he describes how kids like to show off the comic books they are reading with other students. And I'm sure you have all noticed how some students carry their books like accessories, like a talking point to give other students a reason to ask questions and show interest. It oftentimes invites teachers in the building to inquire, and students like when adults are curious about them. I know I'll stop in the halls and ask students about the books they carry with them. It gives me a chance to build relationships with each student and to get a better idea of why students like certain books. Personally, I find my students talk about books to one another, especially graphic novels because they can page through the graphic novels and talk about what they enjoy. Book talking with a peer is enough reason for me to invest in this collection. What needs to happen are conversations between parents and their children, rather than parents and the teachers or parents and the school librarians. I haven't included it in my introductory letter, but I will from now on, that I need to emphasize the importance of parents and students communicating with one another as to what is expected when it comes to checkout. When I do get a parent concern, either in an email or through conversations with teachers, I always try to respect the parent's concern, but to place some responsibility on the student rather than on me and my assistant to police which books are checked out each day. It is considerably easier when students can check out more than one book during a visit. This way, students can have a free choice book and then one which reflects a teacher or a parent expectation. Jenna Grudzicki, writing for the AASL's Knowledge Quest online magazine, wrote on January 2, 2017, "But that's not a real book. Why your collection should include graphic novels," states, quote, "Many parents and educators view graphic novels as glorified comic strips. Many genres are written in graphic novel format, including fantasy, realistic fiction, historical fiction, biography, and nonfiction," end quote. Jenna also offers that graphic novels will attract readers when traditional fiction might not. Quote, "Illustrations provide struggling readers and ESL students with contextual clues," end quote. I will save exploring how we organize our graphic novels in a larger conversation about the organization of our collection in a future episode. I do want to end this episode with some resources for choosing some great graphic novels. I'll attach a link in the show notes. I always consult Junior Library Guild. Although I can no longer afford their subscription, I do check out their past and current recommendations. I also use the ALCS graphic novel reading list. The Association of Library Services to Children is a division of ALA, and they offer PDFs in a broken down into K2, 3, 5, and grades 6 through 8. What caught my eye was the distinction drawn when categorizing graphic novels. Graphic novels on this list are defined as, quote, "full-length story told in paneled sequential graphic format." The list does not include book-length collections of comic strips, wordless picture books, or hybrid books that are a mixture of traditional text and comic graphics. This list includes classics as well as new titles that have been widely recommended as well-reviewed, and books which have popular appeal as well as critical acclaim, end quote. So, sorry, Calvin and Hobbes, the Peanuts Gang, and Garfield. Bound collections of serial comic strips will never make the cut. Another terrific resource, which I've referenced in earlier episodes, is Karina Allen's Books Between podcast. I recommend you listen to episode number 67, Some of the Best Middle Grade Graphic Novels of 2018, which she recorded on January 10th of this year. I especially like the podcast because Karina Allen's show notes always include a complete transcript of each episode. Be sure to check out all the show notes for today's episode. There are links to articles which should be read in their entirety in order to be fully appreciated. I especially want to thank those whose research went into the creation of this podcast today. I want to thank you for listening today. Please consider sharing this podcast with your fellow school librarians and your PLN. I invite your feedback and will return the favor with a podcast sticker. I will be taking next Sunday off, as it is Easter Sunday, and we will be enjoying a family dinner with my daughter, who is in the throes of nursing school final exams. The topic for our next episode will be posted on April 29th, and it will be Gender Issues in Our Collection and Checkout. I hope you will tune in.